So we continue our study in the book of Matthew, and I encourage you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 10, and we're down to about verse 5. This is what's called the limited commission. You know, at the end of Matthew in chapter 28, verse 18 and following, Jesus will send the apostles out to the whole world to preach the gospel and to baptize those who choose to be disciples in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, how do you get this team, these disciples, or how do you get people to a place of faith and of strength that they can endure the kind of struggle they're going to have? By the time we get to the book of Acts, the apostles are going to be beset by many trials. They're going to be imprisoned. They're going to be falsely accused. Tremendous pressure is going to be put on them. They're going to be beaten severely. And then eventually they will all be martyred, every single one, except John, and he will be exiled where he is expected to die alone in his old age. But when you read about the disciples, as we have already by the time we get to chapter 10, it's a pretty amazing transformation where they start and then what we see in the book of Acts. In fact, if it weren't for their names, I'm not sure that we would recognize them, at least based on their behavior. Probably the theme for the disciples through the Gospels seems to be, I'm the greatest, not you. I'm the greatest, not you. That's a topic that they are consumed by. They constantly are talking about it. They get into arguments about it. They compare and contrast themselves to each other. So how do you grow, folks, from a really self-centered, selfish view to such a commitment to the gospel and to the work of Christ and a love for Jesus that their life no longer has any meaning without Him, and in fact, they're quite willing to give up their life in order to be faithful to Him? So how do you do that? Well, chapter 10 is a fascinating study in kind of a training curriculum, if you will, or a preparation about how Jesus will grow them from where they are to where they need to be. So they're called apostles for the first time in verse 2. We talked about last time the difference in the word disciple in verse 1 and the word apostle in verse 2. The word apostle simply means someone who is sent out. A modern word would probably be missionary. And you see that in verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, do not go into the way of the Gentiles and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, at first read, we might read this statement and think, wow, so Jesus is only interested in rescuing Jews, that Jesus doesn't care about the souls of the rest of mankind. Well, there's a couple things we would hasten to point out. One is that just in chapter 8, Jesus was in Gentile country. That's why when he was dealing with those that were demon-possessed and the demons asked to be cast out into a herd of nearby pigs, it's a big sign that they are not in Jewish territory because the Old Testament law forbid the eating of pork and pigs were considered unclean. Jesus is across the boundary, across the border. He's in Gentile country. So if Jesus doesn't care about Gentiles, why would he have been in their territory in chapter 8? Why would he care about healing someone who's demon-possessed? And why would Matthew make the sad point that the community asked him to leave at the end of chapter 8? And the other gospel writers telling us the story tell about how the man that had been healed wanted to go with Jesus, and Jesus told him to stay and to be his witness. And the man makes a phenomenal missionary or evangelist. So there's the first indication that, no, that's not really the issue. And then, of course, secondly, as we've already mentioned in Matthew 28, Jesus sends them to the whole world. So this is why it's called the limited commission. You have a group of Jews who are spiritually immature. There's a scene in John chapter 4 when Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman at the well, and it's an amazing story of redemption, and she is an amazing missionary and evangelist also for who Jesus is as the Messiah. But when the disciples saw Jesus talking to the woman, they never got past that, why is he talking to her kind of stage. So we've got a lot of growing to do. So the first thing that Jesus will do is to send them to their own people. It's a matter of comfort or security to send them to a place that's easy first. Maybe I could ask you this question. So if I were to ask you to put together a lesson about how Jesus is important to you and the difference that he's made, would you rather give that presentation to family and friends? Would you rather give that presentation to a group that you're associated with in Midland? Would you give that presentation in a Bible class or a church fellowship group that you're in? Or would you rather go to some strange, far-off place like Oklahoma or even worse, maybe California, right? Because even in the United States, there are different cultures within our nation. And as you move further away from home, there are kind of some different challenges. You might go somewhere not that far away and people make fun of the way you talk, maybe the accent you have or the words you use. But if you were nervous about going to California or Oregon, what if I said, no, I want you to go to Russia? Well, that's even more challenging because not only is there a different culture, but a whole different language. And so Jesus starts the disciples, these fresh apostles, these new missionaries, off on a mission work, but kind of with training wheels. He sends them to a place where it's still close to home because they will be called to branch out later. So he sends them close to home, and now in verse 7 he says, and as you go, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's the same message John the Baptist began with. It's the same message that Jesus began with. It's get ready because the kingdom is coming, which is an excellent message if you're talking to a Jewish audience. If you're talking to a Gentile audience, especially, let's say, Romans, they would look at you like, what do you mean? The kingdom's already here. His name is Caesar. I don't know what you're talking about. So they're sent to a specific group that they're familiar with which they speak the same language, but they also have the same spiritual heritage. They understand the anticipation for the kingdom, the coming of the Messiah, and that's the language that they're given to speak. And then incredibly in verse 8, Jesus gives them an amazing experience. He says, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Now we noticed in the first verse of the chapter that Jesus gave them this authority. Now he tells them to exercise it. If you have prepared a lesson and you've had an opportunity to give that lesson, whether it's in a Bible class or a men's group or a women's group, or even if you've been teaching in a children's class or something like that, the goal, of course, is in sharing that message that those who listen gain something from it. But if you've ever experienced that, you know what it's like, that you are so often learn more and are blessed more than those who actually hear the message. Can you imagine the impact on the disciples and how meaningful it would be to be able to heal the sick, to be able to see lives changed? Would it affect you at all if you were able to raise the dead? I would think that's something you would remember and be amazed by. And one of the things, if you've had the blessing to share the gospel story with someone and see them be saved, you have seen the dead be raised, or at least you've seen those who are spiritually dead be made alive, and it is an amazing thing. I point this out because there is a little tinge here that just amazes me, and there's a warning here. Because Jesus gave all 12 disciples this authority, and all 12 disciples are going to be able to go out and do this. Has it ever occurred to you, it's certainly something I've thought about recently, is how is it that Judas is given this authority and that Judas is able to share this message, and he's partnered with a disciple as well, and how is it that he could heal the sick or raise their dead or do such good and then end up betraying Jesus? A couple of things come to mind. One is the warning of following Jesus without wholeheartedly following Jesus, and that's going to be a problem that Judas has, as he never lets go, it seems, of his desire for money, and that's an ongoing problem. But secondly, it says a lot about the rest of what Jesus says in this chapter as he prepares them for what's coming. Because this isn't just about doing amazing things. You might even say that doing amazing thing is the byproduct of something else. And that is that they are to give as they've received, that they're sharing something that they have experienced in their own life. And so this is about building their faith. This is about removing themselves from the throne and putting Jesus on the throne of their life. And so how does Jesus teach them to trust him more? Well, look at verse 9. He says, do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. Now, this is a unique place where he tells them this. Later in Luke chapter 22, he'll actually tell them the opposite about how they need to have reserves and resources as they go. But if the goal of this is to teach them to trust him, for the disciples to trust Jesus, and we're going to see that in the book of Acts, they're going to trust Jesus with their lives. They're going to trust Jesus with justice. They're going to be falsely accused and unjustly imprisoned and beaten and so on. But they're going to trust Jesus with their lives, with their reputation, with their future, with their health, everything. How do they get there? So Jesus sets up a faith-building exercise by saying in verse 9, don't bring any reserves. They have no backup plan. When they go out and begin this teaching, what are they going to eat? Where are they going to stay? What are they going to do if they blow out a sandal? You know, nothing worse than a high-speed sandal blowout. What are they going to do if they need another pair of shoes or they need another coat because it's cold or it gets torn or stained or whatever the case may be? They don't have a reserve. They can't just reach in their wallet and bring out their plastic and make it happen. They're going to have to depend on Jesus. He's removed every tool for them to be self-reliant. He says the worker is worthy of his support, so they're going to have to be supported by God through other people, and that's going to be quite a process for them to learn. So then he gives them some practical steps in how that works. Verse 11, "In whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city." So worthiness is going to depend on their reception of Jesus. We saw something like this in chapter 9 in that paragraph of verse 9 through 13 when Matthew is called by Jesus and he calls other tax collectors and publicly known sinners and they're having this celebration and the Pharisees fuss about that and they don't like that, and Jesus talks about he didn't come to call the righteous but sinners, that the idea of worthiness, because ultimately we have no intrinsic worthiness, not in comparison to God. Now, we are worthy because we're created as his children. I mean, we're valuable. That's a better word. We're valuable because we're his children. But if you're talking about from a righteous or holiness standpoint, there's none of us worthy, and it's impossible to be worthy before God's holiness. This worthiness is about whether or not you recognize who Jesus is and you value that. You remember back in chapter 7, you might flip there just real briefly. In verse 6, Jesus touches on the same kind of idea when he says, don't give what is holy to dogs, or don't give your pearls before swine. And in both cases, it's illustrations of the problem with giving something sacred or holy to a dog or pearls before swine is that in neither case does the animal recognize the value or the worth of the gift or the product or the possession. And so it's about a willingness to recognize something or an unwillingness to recognize it. And so how that works out in verse 12, he says, as you enter the house, give it your greeting. A typical Hebrew expression, peace be upon you, would be the shalom, or a very traditional gift or a greeting. Verse 13, if the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace, but if it is not worthy, take back your blessings of peace. The idea is that it bounces, because there is the possibility of rejection, that they can go into this house and pronounce this blessing, and then people repeat it back to you. They reciprocate that in normal Hebrew culture. But as they learn who you are and who you represent and what you're doing, if they don't accept that, if they reject Jesus, the key here is going to be, if they reject Jesus, they're going to reject you. We don't want to be in a place where we're struggling to be accepted where Jesus is rejected. We want our fate to be the same as Jesus. Either he's accepted and so are we, or he's rejected and so are we. That must be the most important thing. It is pretty interesting that Jesus teaches them this, and I would think that would be a memorable experience. If you've going back to that example of your first lesson, you probably remember your first lesson or where you might have preached your first sermon or how you served in some way. Because of the nerves and anxiety and all that, it's probably very memorable. And I would think this is something the disciples would remember. Wouldn't they remember their first miracle? The first time they healed somebody sick, or the first time they raised somebody from the dead? That's kind of a memorable thing. And all of that kind of revolves around the idea of this blessing and this worthiness as people accept or reject Christ. This peace be upon you, or peace to you, which makes it incredibly beautiful later in the gospel in John chapter 20, when the disciples are gathered in the upper room in fear. Jesus has been crucified. His body's placed in the tomb. They've seen the empty tomb, but they didn't quite comprehend all of what that meant. And so John says that they're behind locked doors in fear. And so Jesus appears, and what does he say? He says the same thing. He says that shalom, or that Hebrew culture, that expression of greeting, peace be upon you, or peace to you, which if there's a flash, if they connect the dots in their mind, and perhaps they do it later, they were probably just too busy being shocked and maybe a little frightened, that when they hear Jesus say, "Peace be upon you," now there's a matter of those who are worthy receive it, and those who are not, that greeting bounces, if you will, or reflects. It's the very thing they were set out to do in chapter 10. Jesus ends in chapter 21, or chapter 20 of the Gospel of John. What an amazing experience for them to be reminded of. Verse 14, what do you do when you're rejected? What happens when this greeting of peace is no longer valid, or it is reflected because they're now rejecting them? He says in verse 14, "Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet." Which is another cultural expression. We might say something like, let it just slide off, or let it go, or something like that. This is a way of them saying, I'm no longer carrying this burden. Even the dust that I might have accumulated in your home, I'm no longer carrying that, so I'm releasing that. It's the idea of releasing responsibility, because this is on you. It's the idea of releasing the need for vengeance. I'm done, I'm moving on, I'm not going to carry this anymore. It'd be the literal expression of the opposite of holding a grudge, we say. They're going to shake this off of their feet. And Jesus is teaching them now there's no reason to negotiate or to bargain or to beg, because if they've rejected Jesus, then what else is there? I guess another way to illustrate that, if you were to go somewhere with one of your very good friends, and maybe you were going to, let's say, a third party's house, they're having a barbecue, and what would you do if you show up at the house and they say, "Wow, we're glad you're here, but they can't come in"? I mean, would you be like, "Well, okay," you turn to your friend, "Well, you have to go because the barbecue smells good. I'll catch up with you later"? If you did that, your friendship would take a pretty hard hit. And even more strongly, what would it be like if you did that with your spouse? That you were taking your spouse and you went to some place, mutual friends, or maybe you were just meeting somebody new and they said, "Oh, wow, we really like you. You can stay, but they can't." Well, when you have a decision to make, you choose the one whom you love. And that's what Jesus is pointing out to them, is that they're not being personally rejected. Ultimately, the rejection is of Jesus. Now, there's a part of us that, well, there's a part of me, maybe you're different. There's a part of me that when I'm wronged or there seems something unjust that's happened, the idea of shaking the dust off my feet, I want to carry a little bit of it with me, because it just wasn't right. And I think part of what fuels that is, but this isn't right, and there needs to be some sort of recompense. There needs to be justice here, and that sense of an unsatisfied justice really bothers us, which comes from a good place. Because there should always be a constant seeking for justice and what is right. But in this case, it's about them rejecting Jesus, and so it isn't up for us to exact vengeance or revenge. So he says in verse 15, "Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." Seems to satisfy that, well, this isn't right, or this isn't fair, or this isn't just. I mean, there should really be consequences. And Jesus is saying, oh, there will be. You don't need to worry about that. It's not up to you to try to balance the scales, that there will be a consequence. But I also wonder if they've really considered this, because, well, sure, if we're aggravated with somebody, we might say, well, I hope they get what's coming to them. But if we ever pause long enough and we allow the Spirit of Christ to stir within us, see, we're called to love our neighbors ourselves. In fact, Jesus has already said in the Sermon on the Mount, when he taught us that in chapter 5, he said that we're to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And so if you allow the Spirit to stir very long, there should be a response of compassion and concern. And so maybe part of this as well is, well, you don't want this to happen. When there's this rejection happens and you have to go on, is there truly going to be lost? The Jews understand the reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a complete annihilation, that in spite of Abraham's pleading for salvation, if there would be some found faithful, once Lot is led out of the city, God brings a devastation that Abraham sees from a distance, from a ridge, looks down in the valley and he sees the valley as if it's a furnace. So you talk about flames and heat and smoke and so on. You're talking about just absolute destruction. And so Jesus says this, I don't think with the intent of, aha, see, they got what's coming to them, because if that's really the intent, don't talk to them at all, right? Just let them burn. The whole point is, though, he's sending them as missionaries. He's sending them as rescue workers, as the spiritual first responders to try to get there and help them be rescued. So maybe that also should temper that, oh, well, you're not worthy, you've rejected me, so I hope that, things go poorly for you. Is that this should stir within us a heart of compassion and give us long suffering in our attempt to reach others. Because if we truly understand who people are to God, they are His children, and if we truly understand what it is to be lost, then we can only respond with compassion. It's been said, especially in recovery ministries, that expectations are nothing more than premeditated resentment. That we typically start our day or even our lives with, this is how we want things to go, and we set lists for ourselves, which in and of itself is not bad, having goals and things that we want to accomplish. But one of the things that we can easily slide into is that we set goals, we make lists, or we have expectations that we haven't asked God about. So if we have unprayed over expectations, then what is that exactly? Or maybe if I were to say it a different way, if you have unprayed expectations, what are the chances that your expectations are the same as God's? Probably pretty slim. Then what happens when our expectations are not met, when our list is not accomplished, when our goals are not met, then we get frustrated, stirred up, aggravated, and so on, when maybe that had little to do with the Spirit's leading anyway. So what Jesus does now in verse 16 is he tells them something that helps set their expectations. It is a good thing, it's a human thing, that we have a desire to be loved. That's a good thing. That comes from a great place. However, misplaced, it can become something that is toxic. You can see it today in a drive for, I got to get as many likes on social media, or I got to get as many responses or thumbs up or whatever it is. And what can start to happen is when we begin to derive our self-identity or our self-esteem or our value from the level of appreciation of others, then that is a place that is truly Satan's playground to bring and enact great destruction and pain. Our value and our self-esteem or our self-perception must always come from our Father. But wanting people to get along and wanting to love and to be loved is absolutely a reflection of the fact that we're created in the image of God. That is God Himself. Does not God love us? Yes. Does not God desire to be loved also? Yes. Does God allow rejection to twist His thinking? No. If God is not as loved as He wants to be, does He then throw a fit? No. And so the idea of wanting to have friends, be friends, and have connections is a good thing. However, that can't be the sense of value or our mission. And so in verse 16, Jesus says, behold. So He's told him, you're going to go out and you're going to heal the sick, you're going to cast out demons, you're going to raise the dead. Man, that sounds fantastic, right? Every day is a holiday, every meal is a feast. I mean, it's going to be nothing but just good times all the way through. No. Of course, ultimately, we see that in the life of Jesus, that Jesus has struggles as well. He has Satan constantly tempting. He has the religious leaders constantly insulting Him. He has people constantly rejecting Him that ends ultimately in the suffering on the cross. So if we're following Him, and that's where He goes, and He's a whole lot better, perfectly so, at this than we are, then shouldn't we expect some difficulties? He says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Now, if you know sheep and you know wolves, that's not a very encouraging statement. What are the chances a sheep has? And if it would just be like one sheep or a whole bunch of sheep and one wolf, I mean, I don't know, maybe a few of them get by, but it's sheep in the midst of wolves, plural, so this isn't good. Sheep are known for many things, but they're not known for their viciousness. I know some folks who have raised lambs and raised sheep, and to this day have not yet seen a sign on their property line that says, "Behold of attack sheep," or "Beware of attack sheep," brother. It's just not an issue. If you're a sheep in the midst of wolves, there's only one outcome. It's going to hurt, right? There's going to be damage. You're going to be consumed. And so it's interesting that he tells them, just want you to know that you're going to be overpowered right out of the gate. You're going out, well, wait a minute, I thought we were healing the sick and casting out demons and raising the dead. Sure, he's giving you authority over the spiritual realm, but you've not been, at least in a limited fashion, but you've not given authority over people's free will. Even Jesus won't violate that. He will not overwhelm. He won't wave his hand and then people do the right thing. He won't wave his hand and people think the right thing. He allows them to choose, even if it's detrimental, especially to himself. So the same is true for the disciples. It's going to be hard. They're the sheep. They're not the wolves. It's going to hurt. So there's a point to this. It's not, well, so don't even try, or you're already defeated before you started, but rather, so you need a mindset, a willingness to serve. In just one verse, it seems to me that Jesus gives us the message of 1 Peter. If you want to do some extra reading in our study, the reading just the 5 chapters of 1 Peter is about the power of suffering, about our willingness to suffer and how it unleashes the Spirit's power in our life. But it requires suffering. Here he says, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, which is an interesting mix. Be wise. Don't be shocked. Don't be surprised. Be prepared. Be ready ahead of time. It's always interesting if we wait till we're in a crisis to try to think through what to do. That's really hard, nearly impossible to have the calmness and the serenity of mind to be able to rationally work your way through a crisis. You're just too busy reacting. And so there are questions of conviction that must be answered before the crisis comes, about what we're going to do, what we're willing to suffer, and so on, and be wise. It reminds us again of, so don't give what's holy to dogs. Don't give your pearls before swine. It doesn't mean that you don't try to serve people in difficult situations, but understand, don't be so shocked and shut down by a potential negative reaction. What's interesting is that we are to maintain an innocence, innocent as doves. We have an expression where we might say someone is naive. You know, they're just so open, they're so trusting, and they're just so shocked when something bad happens or somebody takes advantage of them. He said, don't be like that. Be shrewd as serpents. Understand that that's the way the world is. But see, normally when we get that, we call it street smarts or something to that effect, that when we do get that kind of wisdom, what happens is it's so easy to become hardened and cynical and negative. And, well, that's the way people are. They're always looking for a buck, or they're always trying to rip you off, or, all that kind of stuff. And you develop a pretty dark, negative, pessimistic attitude, and most tragically, you begin to have a negative attitude about the value of other people. If the whole point of this operation is rescue, then those lives have to matter. But can you imagine a fireman standing in front of a burning house and people crying for help, and the fireman's like, those dummies, they got themselves in this pickle, and really, they deserve what's coming to them. If that process ever starts, there's no rescue, because suffering and risk is involved in such a rescue. So how do we gain wisdom without becoming so calloused by the experience that we lose this innocence, this openness, this purity in our hearts? Well, the best way to gain wisdom without gaining cynicism would be to learn from others, specifically to learn from Jesus, or for us to learn from the Word of God. We can gain that wisdom without all the scars, which allow us to continue to be open and not have so much scar tissue. So easily we slide into a need for affirmation and love. Well, again, we're created that way, but we're created to look to God for love and affirmation as far as our ultimate value. When we reassign that to human beings, when we depend on other humans to affirm our value, then there's a toxic manipulation. So now in verse 17, he says, but beware of men, just in general, humans. Well, it's not about they're not valuable, because this is a rescue mission. They're going out as on a mission, but he's saying that you put your trust in God. That's why you don't have a backup plan. That's why you depend on God to provide for you. And some days are going to be skinnier than others, and some houses accept you and some reject you. But it's all about trusting that God has your back, that God's going to provide. And that's why it says, but beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, that they will not always accept you, and there will be suffering. Now, he just said that they're wolves, and now he's getting a little more specific. And as we've already mentioned, every single one of these men will experience the very things that he's saying. Judas doesn't, of course, because he betrays Jesus and then hangs himself before the resurrection. But all the other 11 plus Paul, and then, of course, our Christian brothers and sisters throughout the centuries endure these very things. So beware of men. So don't put your trust in them. Don't put your confidence in them. Don't look for affirmation from them, because they're going to drag you up in their courts and scourge you in their synagogues, which is a stunning statement that I often read quickly and don't catch. So the scourging is more than a whipping. It's being tied typically to a structure and then a long whip being used, but it's the idea of ripping the flesh from the back. It's not just the whipping in the sense of you're going to have red marks. It's going to be tearing the flesh. What's interesting is he says, where's the scourging going to happen? In the synagogues. So that's like the most rejection or the most evil being done to them personally will be done in the church by church people. I mean, that's kind of the Jewish equivalent. It'll be done by their fellow Jews in places of learning and of worship, in the synagogues, which is shocking and breathtaking, which is why he's telling them now. He's setting their expectations that it's going to be hard, is an understatement. Verse 18, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. When we're suffering unjustly, if we're being scourged in the synagogues, there's every opportunity to think, man, is this worth it? Or these people aren't worth it, or this is not even worth trying, and we're going nowhere, and we're not accomplishing anything, and that sort of thing would be really easy to get to. But Jesus already gives them a hint in verse 18 when he says that when you're suffering for my sake, it's a testimony. That's a part of their mission. Just like he will do for us, so they will do for others. And so the very place where we are suffering the most, or where we feel the most rejected, may be the brightest that our light shines because of the darkness. Jesus says, this is for a purpose. You're my testimony. So he encourages them in verse 19. It's kind of time for some encouragement, isn't it? So they're sheep in the midst of wolves. You're going to be scourged and you're going to be handed over. So finally he says, verse 19, but when they hand you over, don't worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given to you in that hour what you are to say. Well, I resonate with the second part of that. Don't worry about what you're going to say, because, what I want to say isn't going to be positive. It's going to be, hey, this isn't right, or how dare you, or, who do you think you are, or things like that. And so saying things that are helpful, saying things that are meaningful, just the normal human confusion or struggle with public speaking, that sort of thing. But really what's interesting to me is he says, don't worry. He didn't say just what you will say, but he also said, don't worry about how you're going to be able to say. I don't know if you've thought about that. That's something I've enjoyed this particular time through the text is, well, what do you mean how? Well, there's at least a couple of possibilities. How are you going to speak if you're being scourged? I'm thinking again of the cross and how Jesus says 7 incredibly wonderful, beautiful things from the cross, but just the act of speaking and what it's going to cost him in terms of pain and suffering is immense. So how are you going to speak if you're in the middle of suffering? How are you going to have the physical ability to do so? And again, not just so what are you going to say? And even if you have the ability to speak in these various expressions of suffering, but how does that work? I mean, are they going to give you a chance to speak, or are they not going to speak? Should you just yell all of a sudden and interrupt something and try to get a few words in? But what Jesus is saying is, I'm going to give you what to say, but he's even going to give us the how. Whether that's the strength to do it when the time comes because of physical pain, or because of fear, or because of confusion, or the opportunity, the window, the time when people will stop and hear what's being said. All of this is about simply Jesus saying to them two words: trust me, trust me. Verse 20, for it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. What an interesting way to say that. The Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. When they are suffering, there's every opportunity to feel abandoned, to want to cry out, God, where are you? God, why don't you do something? Or, I thought you said you'd be with me. There's every opportunity to feel abandoned, and Jesus says, I'm going to give you the how and I'm going to give you the what, because the Spirit of your Father is within you. In the book of Acts, we'll read about Stephen and how he will be drug out, and he will have people angry with him. I don't know if you've ever tried to speak to a crowd who is so angry they hate you. And in fact, the text is they gnash their teeth at him. They're chomping at him. That's pretty mad. And he delivers an amazing full chapter sermon of the entire summary of God's work from the beginning with the Israelites all the way through to the cross. It's an amazing one chapter history of all of God's work. Incredible, incredible message of clarity and of power when he's in such a hostile environment. When he's finished, because it comes to Jesus and the call to accept him as the Messiah, they go nuts and they literally stone him to death. So there's Stephen standing his ground, and then he's beaten to the ground as stones are raining in, and it's not an instant process. It's not like modern times when it's determined that someone is to be executed. You're looking for something swift and painless and instant and so on. It's not what they were looking for. Rock after rock is going to land and hurt and thud and bruise and break bones, and then it's likely that you're either going to finally die from internal hemorrhaging or bleeding, or finally from a head injury, but none of that probably is going to be instant. Certainly it wasn't for quite a while for Stephen. So while the rocks are literally raining down on Stephen, Jesus said, I'll give you the how and I'll give you the what. Man, I'm telling you what, Stephen had both. But as he's collapsing under the weight of the rocks, he looks up and he says, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the throne of God, that he sees Jesus, that he's right there with him, and that he's going to be joining them imminently. And then he says, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He pleads for the forgiveness of those that are killing him while he's dying. Talk about strength. You talk about peace. Stephen is an amazing example of a disciple that would follow based on the apostles' teaching, that would get to know Jesus, and that he would learn to trust Jesus. And that though he was rejected very viciously by everybody else, he found peace and he found strength. Jesus will continue to set their expectations. He'll also encourage them through the rest of this chapter. But this whole chapter is as he's pulling them together and saying, you're going to get to go do these things. I'm thinking, if I'm one of the disciples, that first few sentences, don't go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. Whew, I didn't want to go to them anyway. And oh, by the way, get to these amazing things. Right on, this sounds good. And then the rest of the chapter is really sobering as Jesus prepares them and for us for service. Would you pray with me as we conclude? Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be in your word tonight. We're thankful, Lord, for your tender care for your disciples and for us. Lord, help us to grow in our faith. Help us to look not at life's aggravations and shortcomings, but rather help us to see the opportunities to trust you and to lay our burdens at your feet. Thank you, Lord, for your love that brings such peace and such joy. Help us to be vessels of both, that others may see you. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.